This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I want to thank Ruby for reviewing the podcast on podchaser.com. You can review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, podchaser.com, and you can rate the podcast on Spotify. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Please consider joining the Deconversion Anonymous private Facebook group that is found at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. Every week after the episode drops, we have a community hangout on Tuesday evening at 5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Eastern. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guest today is Deb. Deb is in her 70s and only recently went through a deconstruction process where she has experienced a lot more freedom of who she can love, what she can read, and no longer being tied down by the bounds that Christianity placed on her. Deb became a Christian at 6 years old, and she married her high school sweetheart. They went on to be missionaries in various places within Africa and doing missionary training in Switzerland for decades. Deb and her husband Paul came back to the States to better support their son and their children as they went into college. And Paul began to do ministry there. Deb jumped in and was a leader at the church as well, until Paul's bid to be ordained was rejected, and ultimately he lost his job. This was devastating to Deb and Paul, and it caused them to reevaluate what they believed as they got some distance away from the church for the first time in decades of their life together. The next episode will be Paul's story. There is a small chance that will be 2 weeks from now instead of 1 week from now, but I'm going to try to do everything I can to get that done next week. Either way, stay tuned for Paul's story as well. Here is Deb to tell her story. Deb, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here. I've enjoyed a lot of your podcasts already.
Really appreciate that. You and your husband, Paul, come highly recommended from multiple people, from Arlene, from Marla. So I'm very excited to finally get to talk to you. And I think eventually I'll get to talk to Paul as well. So,
yes,
yeah.
I believe you will. Yeah.
Yeah. But today is all about you, Deb. So I want to hear your story. And so what was it like for you growing up, and what faith tradition did you grow up with?
Okay. Well, I'll start out by saying I'm a 71-year-old woman, and my husband will be married, and I will be married 50 years next year.
Wow. Congratulations. That's awesome.
We have 4 children, ages 36 to 46, and 9 grandchildren.
Wow. Okay.
So I could be competing for your oldest podcast person.
I'm not going to say, but maybe.
I grew up in a very loving family, but it was very conservative. We grew up in an independent Bible church, would be the denomination, or non-denomination, I should say. I told my mom I wanted to ask Jesus into my heart at age 6 after watching Billy Graham on our round screen TV. So that dates me there.
Okay.
I was the oldest of 5. I am the oldest of 5 children, and my parents enrolled us in the local Christian day school and took us to church twice on Sunday and once on Wednesday. Our family always seemed to struggle financially, though. My dad was a car salesman and had depression issues, but the church community and the activities where our world was in this bubble gave us a belief system and a support system that seemed to just really be important to my parents.
Yeah, and again, I do try to say this quite often, right? I think it's all natural elements of people being together, but the community, there can be very positive community experiences with church, and it really is something that we crave as human beings. And so it's fine to look back fondly on some experience.
Yeah, and I have different segments of my life would have described that the mission community and the church community. They were all very important to us, but it was the system of beliefs that sort of broke down eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, a lot of people that have talked on your podcast talk about the belief system that was pounded into us, that we had the truth and all other people were going to hell. And there was a huge emphasis on missions in our church, mostly foreign missions. And this constantly tugged at my very compassionate heart, because I certainly didn't want anybody to go to hell.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, and I was a very sensitive, as I look back, I was a very sensitive little girl and young person and growing up. And the obligation to witness to others so that they would have a chance to be saved was a huge and constant burden on my heart and mind. When we went to a Christian school through 8th grade, private Christian school. That was the beginning of the Christian school movement. And but then in 9th grade, I had to go to public school and switch at that point. And that burden to witness to my fellow students, and many of them were Jewish in the school that I went to. I mean, I just tried so hard to befriend them and to communicate my faith to them. And it was a huge burden.
Yeah, you're really touching on something that I think is significant. Like, if you take the story seriously, the people around you, and you truly believe that they're going to hell, you should do absolutely everything you can to stop that from happening. And so, exactly. That burden on a child or a teenager is just ridiculous. And
it was. And I look back on that, you know, I really pity that little girl, you know, I mean, I mean, it was huge. And now not everybody, I think, internalized it that way. You know, I think it's a personality thing maybe too, but it certainly weighed on me. And parallel to all that, as I was growing up, was the purity culture and being pure sexually. And I was striving so hard to be perfect. And the whole thing of confessing your sins to God. And I remember just, because I was such a good little girl, I could hardly think of anything to confess, you know? Yeah. It was like, let's see, what did I do today that I need to confess? And it would be like, oh, well, I sort of had a prideful thought there, you know? I mean, I would just analyze to death my inner workings of my brain, you know, to come up with a confession. So I was really trying to be perfect. So the summer after my junior year in high school, I became a child evangelism missionary, and I taught Good News clubs all summer.
Okay.
And that was a pretty big thing to do as a junior in high school. And I was a very faithful member of Harrisburg Youth for Christ, and I led the Youth for Christ club in our high school. And I prayed, as I said, fervently for the salvation of my Jewish high school friends and my cousins who were Presbyterians.
Oh dear.
Who hadn't prayed the prayer. You know, I mean, it was just so ridiculous as I look back. But I totally was bought into this, you know, this system. And the other thing that I look back on that really freaked me out was the whole thing of the rapture.
Yeah.
I saw this really creepy movie. I was a teenager, I think, and they showed this really weird movie in our church about the rapture. And I just, you know, I just never felt good about that after that. You know, it was just really weird.
For sure. I think the thing I've been really affected by listening to people's stories is the hell anxiety and rapture anxiety. And particularly for kids that grow up with it in some fundamentalist form from day one, that, you know, long into their adulthood, they're still unpacking that and trying to escape it.
Oh, yeah. And when I would have my devotions every day, and I would, with this whole thing of foreign missions, you know, the obligation of giving up all my desires and hopes and accepting God's will for my life. And And, I wrestled with God because I knew that I needed to submit to the potential of being a foreign missionary, and I would go through my mind and figure out, let's see, where would I be willing to go, Africa or Asia or whatever. And and I just remember wrestling with that and with God over that whole thing, and it was, and so I guess ironically and maybe providentially, whatever you want to say, my boyfriend growing up went to my church, which was Paul, who became my husband, and we dated all through high school, and we were pretty serious, but we were both headed toward missions, so that was worked out well. But I went to, my pastor encouraged me to go to Columbia Bible College in South Carolina. And Paul went to Moody Bible Institute because he was interested in aviation. So his cool thing to do,
he's going to be a pilot. Yeah.
Yeah, bush pilot. So he prepared to do that. And I got a BA in biblical education from Columbia Bible College. And we were married right after that, after we graduated from college. And a year and a half later, at age 23, we left for Niamey, Niger.
Wow.
We knew what we wanted to do, or what God wanted us to do, I should say. And we did it, and we left and we stayed in Niger for 6 weeks until our visa was provided for Nigeria. That's where we lived for 6 years, and Paul was a bush pilot there for SIM, Sudan Interior Mission, for 6 years, and our first 2 kids were born there. So the biggest struggle for me then was homesickness, because I really missed my family, and I wanted them to see my little kids grow up and that kind of thing. But I rose to the challenge, and I lived my life as a missionary wife and mom. Was I learned how to do all the things you were supposed to do, make your homemade bread and do everything.
And how about the work itself? I've had a lot of missionaries on that talk about having a moment of realization where they recognize, who am I to tell these people how to live their lives?
Yeah. Well, I don't think we quite got there yet.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I taught Bible once a week in a school in Jos, Nigeria, and we were still very enthusiastic about, reaching the world for Jesus.
Okay. Yep. I'm not going to hold that against you.
No. But it, I should say that because it took us a long time to get to that point.
Got it. Okay.
But then the aviation department closed down in Nigeria. So the next place where Paul actually thought we should go, the group we should go with, is Wycliffe Bible Translators, who they have an aviation department as well.
Okay.
But I knew that if we went with Wycliffe, I would have to go to jungle camp. And I dreaded that.
Okay.
Because I just don't like camping or anything like that.
Yeah.
So, but it turns out, I wrestled with God on my knees and became to the point where I would submit, to this plan. And so we did. We went with Wycliffe Bible Translators, and jungle camp I almost lost my sanity because we had to stay with this Mexican family for 4 weeks, and we slept on the middle room, on the floor of their middle room of 3 rooms in their house.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
And I had a 9-month-old baby, and he got diarrhea, and it was horrible. But so anyway, that's a long story. But then we were assigned to Cameroon after that. We made it through the orientation program. But before we went to Cameroon, we had to spend a year and a half learning French, because Cameroon is a French-speaking country.
Mm-hmm.
So then we moved to Switzerland. We lived in Switzerland to learn French, which was not a hardship post exactly, but it had a lot of challenges, learning a language and stuff.
Sure.
And but that was sort of the beginning, I think, of our shakeup of our belief system, because drinking wine was a no-no growing up, and we began to drink wine in Switzerland and enjoyed it.
Scandalous.
Yeah. And I remember coming back from Switzerland and telling my mom, and oh, she was so upset that I now drank wine. It was just, oh, that was terrible. After our time in Switzerland learning French, we then left for Yaoundé, Cameroon, which is the capital city of Cameroon.
Okay.
And our youngest was born 5 months after we arrived in Cameroon. I got pregnant in Switzerland. It must have been that wine, you know. And anyway, so then we were 15 years in Cameroon, and
15 years. Back, wow. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. I mean, we came home every couple of years, but we were still, you know, missionaries for that length of time.
Yeah. Okay.
And I was thinking back on that, and I was thinking how I depended on James Dobson's books for raising my kids, you know, the whole discipline thing and Dare to Discipline and all that. And I sort of, you know, of course I have regrets about that now, but as I look back, they did turn out okay. So in spite of all that.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, we lived 15 years in Cameroon, and that was like you said about the community. We really did enjoy our missionary community there. Sure. And had good times, made good friends. We had some trauma. I mean, we were constantly trying to survive the crazy African city traffic, and the threat of malaria was always, you know, in the back of my mind.
Right,
you know,
right. With little kids too, that must be terrifying.
Yeah, it was terrifying. And even some of our best friends, their 2 children died of malaria.
Wow.
When they were actually had just come back on furlough in Canada, and the kids came back sick and then died in the hospital. That was a real trauma to observe that and to be close to them. So yeah, and so then another challenge being missionaries was when our kids got to be college age. Our oldest son got to be 18 and was going to go back to the States, and we didn't have plans we were going to continue on being missionaries, and hopefully we were hoping that he would settle into Wheaton College where he was accepted. And since there was a lot of MKs there and everything, that we thought he'd be happy there and safe, and we could go on with our work. But it turned out he was not happy there at all. And he dropped out after 3 semesters and then started hitchhiking all over the place. And he'd call and tell us, oh, I guess where I'm going next, you know, and I would just my stomach would just turn, you know, because he was just like, he was sort of like a global nomad, because we had taken him so many places that he was comfortable moving around and traveling, you know, and that intrigued him. And
probably no sense of home. What is home?
Yes,
right?
Exactly right. Or another way of saying that is anywhere is home.
That's true. Yeah.
You know, I mean, you're at home anywhere in the world.
That's
so
true.
It didn't, you know, however you want to say it, they're both true. And but eventually, I mean, the story about him is that he eventually did go back to Wheaton College and married a lovely young woman, got his master's in American University, and their yesterday was their 20th anniversary.
Oh, very cool.
Wedding anniversary, and they're doing great, you know. So the story, but in the meantime, watching him come to that point was like torture for me, you know. It was really hard. And so because of this, I'm saying this because these were situations that sort of made us realize that, hey, we got to come back to the States, and because we have 2 more kids coming up here, and we don't want to make the same mistake and be on the other side of the pond while they're struggling over here, you know. so we came home to try to help Nate and bought a house in Hershey here. But we're only here for 2 years at that point. We came back to Hershey because that was the home of our largest supporting church, Hershey Evangelical Free Church. And so after 2 years, we thought we got him sort of settled, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul had been chosen to be the director of the mission group in Cameroon with Wycliffe for 2 more years. So we were obligated to go back for 2 more years. So we went back for 2 more years and then did leave Cameroon in 2000 for good.
Okay.
So in June of 2000, we were back here in Hershey settling in, and we had our 3rd child was starting college and our 4th was in 9th grade. So that was 2000. And Paul actually was able to get a pastor's position in this church that was our largest supporting church.
Okay.
So he was the visitation pastor at the church, and he visited the senior adults, and he did a really good job of that. The older people just loved him. And I jumped into church work as well. I mean, I got a job being a substitute teacher during the day, but I was very much involved in the church stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
I was really passionate about prayer. That was my thing. And I even, right at the beginning, one of the other pastor's little kids got leukemia. 4-year-old got leukemia.
Ooh, wow. Okay.
And since I was very passionate about prayer, I organized around the clock prayer sign-up sheet and got, for every 15 minutes, there was somebody praying for this little boy, and I just knew that the more we prayed, the likelihood of God answering was,
yeah,
higher. So anyway, unfortunately, the little boy did die. That was sad.
I'm very sorry. Yeah, I'm sure that's harder too, like putting all of your energy into trying to pray for that. Yeah.
But at this point, I still was, even though this all happened, I was just still very, very focused on prayer. I bought lots of books on prayer. I went to conferences. I loved Brooklyn Tabernacle. I don't know if you've heard of Brooklyn Tabernacle and their prayer ministry. Yeah, and they have this big choir and prayer ministry. And I went to their prayer conferences and went to their church sometimes to just experience this great prayerful church. And I was frustrated with the Hershey Free Church and that they didn't have the same passion, that
Right.
The pastors didn't have the same passion I did for prayer. And I came to the conclusion they don't really even believe in prayer,
Yeah.
And I look back now and I think it's their theology, their theology of the sovereignty of God, I think, has an influence on why they don't pray. But anyway, sure. So I was really devoted to the belief that prayer made a difference. And so I just kept doing that. I started the Wednesday night prayer meeting at church, and I got a prayer room established in the church. And all this time, my mom and dad and my sister and brother were a part of this church as well.
Okay.
So this was our Christian bubble in which we lived for 11 years after coming home from Africa.
Okay.
And sorry, the timeline here is a little mixed up, but in about 2005, 2006, it was expected of Paul to be ordained in the Evangelical Free Church denomination.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And he had to go through a series of questions and write out a paper and spend hours and hours doing this. And then he was interrogated by this council.
Okay.
And it was what I had observed from other people, other pastors that had gone through this process, was that it was like a shoo-in, like it was just a formality.
Yeah.
Like they always got ordained. They'd have a big party because so-and-so got ordained, blah, blah, blah. But my husband didn't get ordained. They refused his ordination.
Wow.
And
After decades of missionary
yes,
work and wow.
yes. And the people loved him in his ministry at the church. And it was like, wait a minute, this is really, really weird. And they said he didn't, and I'm maybe taking some of his steam out of his interview, but they said he didn't speak fast enough. He didn't answer the questions fast enough. And he was also a little light on hell because,
right.
because he said he believed in hell, but he didn't like that doctrine.
Right.
So they didn't like his answer. So it didn't change his job description or his work at all. He had a license of ministry or something instead of being ordained. I was really mad, and I even said to him, I said, that is abuse,
Yeah,
I told
yeah.
him. But he kept, it was our bread and butter. So
Sure.
he didn't feel like he could buck the system at that point, right? It was too much. We were too entwined, and this was our livelihood.
Yeah.
So he didn't question that very much. He just went on with his work. But I began to question another parallel thing that was happening was that I began to question why women were not allowed to be elders or pastors in this church.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I got involved in was I heard about this spiritual direction course that was being offered by the United Methodists in our area.
Okay.
And that sort of intrigued me. So I signed up for this course. And it was 1 weekend a month for 2 years. I went to this retreat center 1 weekend a month for 2 years, and had heard all kinds of, different people talk, and got to meet a lot of really cool people. Many of them were women who were pastors within the United Methodist Church.
Interesting. Okay.
So I was really intrigued with this, and I thought, hey, I went to this spiritual direction course and met really cool other women who were pastors in the United Methodist Church. So this was really cool. I thought, wow, this denomination is really, really progressive,
Yeah.
and I like this, and so I've heard a lot of, sort of edgy things. By edgy, I mean, it was edgy for me then.
Yeah.
Of like they talked about Carl Jung and dreams and, lots of things that I had never been exposed to before, And so that was really fun for me. I really enjoyed it and felt, like I was learning new things. And another thing that happened around that time was I got involved in a progressive Christian book club in the area. And a friend of mine told me about it. And so I started going to that, and I heard about authors like Richard Rohr and John Shelby Spong.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started, hearing all this new kind of stuff about even different ways to think of the atonement, and and I thought, wow, there's more ways than the one I was taught. I had no idea that there were other people that had different ideas about these theological doctrines, So I was really being, intrigued by all this new information and these new authors. And I read Rob Bell's book, Love Wins, and that brought into question the whole doctrine of hell. And so I was just, all these things were opening up to me at this point, and another book that I came across was why I've changed my mind about women in leadership. I don't know if you've heard of that book, but it's like, I don't know, 20, 25 chapters. Of each chapter is a different prominent evangelical leader who gave their who talks about how they changed their mind about women in leadership.
Okay.
They looked at their theology, they researched the scriptures again, and came to the conclusion that they were wrong before, and now, women should be equal to men.
Yeah.
So that was another book that was really blew my mind too.
Yeah.
And so, amazingly enough, they after 11 years of working there at the church, they gave him a sabbatical.
Okay.
So he was having a sabbatical, and he went to Switzerland for we had friends that lived there, and so he went there for a few weeks, and I joined him there. And at this point, I had been reading these books, and so I was really, we talked a lot about that. And when he got back from his sabbatical, it wasn't long after that, about a month, I think, where, because there was a change in leadership at the church at the time, they called him into the office and said, "We're letting you go."
Oh, wow.
And we had no clue that was going to happen.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it was like, they gave the excuse that it was a financial decision, but it didn't make sense to us.
Yeah.
And so we just, so he didn't know what he was going to do. We're both about 60 years old, and we found out quickly that it's hard to get a job when you're 60.
Wow.
It's hard to change, directions. And so he started driving bus, and his first school bus he drove, and then he got a job with a charter bus company.
Okay, so the church lets Paul go, which is just devastating. But I guess Paul then was able to start driving a bus that was, putting bread on the table, so to speak.
Yes. But during this time, I was really angry that we had gotten kicked out of the church.
I can imagine.
And he was too. But he was, his focus was on getting another job, really. So anyway, I think, but that's what we needed. We needed to get kicked out of the church to begin to be more honest with our doubts and questions. And so I now see that as a good thing, and otherwise I think we would still be there, perhaps. I don't know.
You may have heard me mention that I think the pandemic and people having to stay home and watch church services streaming will have this exact effect. As soon as you aren't in the environment where it's being reinforced 3 times, 4 times a week,
exactly,
you begin to just be honest with yourself, and it can be devastating, but it also can be incredibly freeing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so I started to really enjoy my Sundays.
Yeah.
I did a lot of processing through writing poetry and just, I just loved being not going to church, and, after 60 years of feeling like I have to go every time the doors are open, it just was amazing, the release that was.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of course, we still had our families and friends that, we had our families, our friends, we didn't see our friends as much anymore. Obviously, we're out of that bubble.
Yeah.
But my parents and my sister and brother are still in the area, or were still in the area at that time. And so I think they thought that we were just bitter and unforgiving of the church. And that's why we didn't go to church anymore.
There's always some easy excuse for people to point at, to make it easy for them to dismiss any valid reasons you might have.
it kind of hurt us that they couldn't understand that rupture in our lives. It was like, you should be able to get over that. So anyway, as I said, I processed a lot of things through poetry, and if you don't mind, I did pick out a poem to read that I wrote in 2015. Is it okay
Yes,
if
please.
I read it?
Yeah.
Okay. It's called Just Suppose. Just suppose God is love, complete, full, and overflowing. Just suppose love is stronger than death, always winning and overflowing. Just suppose every knee will bow to the one who personified this love, not excluding the worst sinner. Then this is good news over and above. Just suppose God the Father truly loves all the creatures he has made. Could a mother send her wayward son to hell? I cannot comprehend it. How can that be love, pray tell? Just suppose the cross showed us how to suffer, and the empty tomb to rise and win with joy. What if we are all already forgiven, and getting saved isn't a ticket or a ploy? What then? Then I know love always, always wins, and we're all held in its embrace, never to leave or get lost. I call that amazing grace. So I wrote that in 2015.
Okay.
And that was one of many poems that I wrote. But also at this point, since we needed to make money, and Paul was working, he was driving bus, and I opened an Airbnb in our home.
Oh, okay.
And it was a suggestion made by one of our friends. And I loved having people in our home and from all over the world. It was really great. And it was just so fun for me.
And you'd be uniquely qualified to do that too.
Yeah.
I
mean, and a lot of people can't imagine having strangers in their house, but I just, it didn't bother me at all. So that was a really neat outlet for me as well during that time of beginning to pull away from church. And but around the same time, I was taking care of my parents more and more because they were getting elderly. And then, of course, the 2016 election and all that. Okay. And that just brought so much tension between me and my family, in addition to the, having not going to church anywhere. And now I was against Trump. And they couldn't understand that, and I couldn't understand them.
Yeah.
I was just baffled at their support, and
as was my wife,
yeah. And one time I would always, build myself up, before I went to visit my mom and dad. I thought, oh dear, what am I going to say? And how am I going to say it? And it was just always these conversations that I was imagining in my head that we would go through, when we did have one. And I managed to stay away from the discussion, except for one time I did bring it up. And I said, Mom and Dad, you brought me up. I'm thankful for the way you brought me up to be honest and good. And I said, that's the reason I don't like him, because of the way you brought me up to be, to be good, and my mom just sort of patronizingly said, well, we still love you, and all this. And I said, well,
despite this, we still love you.
I know. I said, Mom, I'm sorry. I don't need to hear that right now. But it was like, this tension started building between us and in with the other members of my family as well. So we moved politically away from the way that most of our friends and relatives were, and I became another effort that I poured myself into was to become the precinct leader for in our township for the Democrats.
Okay.
So I I I do see the even evangelistic way of being brought up. I also sense that I've tried to do that with my deconstruction as
Sure.
well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Be evangelistically deconstructed or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I also became very evangelistically Democrat, so that's one thing I have to unlearn. I know that about myself, that I have to be really careful about trying to convince people that I'm right.
I want to make this point really quick because I think that's super normal, right? Like that's just like, especially, growing up, living an entire lifetime of evangelism. I now have this truth. I must
Yeah.
give it away.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that people don't believe me, but I try to say about the podcast is I'm actually not interested in making more deconverts.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm really interested in is providing a space for people to doubt and express that, and wherever they land to be able to talk about that, tell their story.
Yeah.
And that's hard. Like I can't tell you, a day doesn't go by that I watch a YouTube video or see something on Twitter that I want to jump in real bad. And sometimes I jump in anyway. But yeah, there's that instinct to you seem to be mistaken here. Let me help you is very hard to kill.
It's really amazing. It's amazing how deep that is inside of me. And I'm glad I recognize it, but it's really hard to combat,
Yes.
Anyway, so I'm getting involved in the Democrat. I'm still involved with the Democrats in my township, and I've deconstructed to the point where my doubts have caused me to shift in things that I believe are true. Right. My whole concept of prayer has changed. I don't read my Bible. I got a friend who trained people in Reiki.
Okay.
Which is a way of, it's a healing method. And so I've done 2 courses of Reiki. And so when I still have concerns for people when I hear they're really sick or troubled or whatever, instead of praying, I will exercise my Reiki techniques for them, So I'm sort of interested in sort of the metaphysical, the unseen stuff still. I'm also intrigued with Celtic theology. I've read some of John Philip Newell books, like he's written Listening to the Heartbeat of God, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, and the Rebirthing of God. And what I learned from him was this point of being born in blessing instead of being born in sin. And that really attracts me. That I really like that, as opposed to, so I've deconstructed from the being born in sin doctrine. So I can't believe in hell anymore. And the Bible obviously isn't inerrant.
True.
So but what I feel like is that I just think it's so important to be curious and being a lifelong learner. And that's kind of my my purpose for living is just to be a learner, and at the same time, I realize I have to unlearn all these things that are really deeply embedded in my psyche and my whatever, the way I was brought up for 60 years. Patterns for 60 years are really hard to break. I had a conversation with my mom, which was really hard, about 6 months before she died. And she which was amazing to me that she had the courage to ask me, because many of my relatives and friends don't even know how to approach me and ask me what happened. Right.
Yeah, exactly. That's my experience. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so weird because I wish they would, but my mom said to me, she said, Debbie, why don't you ever talk about Jesus anymore? And I was just caught off guard. And I don't even remember how I answered completely. But I just told her, I said, Mom, you don't have to worry about me going to hell.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I told her. And anyway, the conversation ended kind of on a good note. We hugged each other and we, said we still loved each other a lot. But she never said another thing about it after that. But it seemed like it maybe relieved her of her worry about me. I don't
Or
know.
obligation.
Yeah, obligation.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a really hard thing for me. So many old friends have sort of faded away. At the moment, I don't have a lot of, well, the pandemic also contributed to this. I don't see my sister and brother very much.
I'm very sorry to hear that. I
Yeah.
do know what the cost of what we're talking
Yeah.
about here, the friendships and family
Yeah.
connections, and it's for real. It is very painful
is.
to watch those fade away, and I'm very sorry for that.
Yeah. I even had to break off one of the groups of friendships that I had hung on to these were missionary friends of mine from Cameroon.
Okay.
And we had these reunions. We kept seeing each other, even though we all left Cameroon. And so I eventually I just couldn't, we would always have this intense prayer time together and I just couldn't handle that anymore. So I had to break away from that group. But it was, it was as a result of the change in me, right? I
Right.
mean, like you said, it's like that's the cost of changing your belief system, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It really still does frustrate me that that many of them don't ask me or what's going on. I've been told by some people who have asked me that, can't you understand? They're probably in shock because this Deb and Paul Haken,
yeah,
they were the most devoted people we ever knew,
right. Right.
And now they've jumped ship, I mean, so I do have some friends. I mean, I have a different set of friends, and I'm thankful for them. I have a little book club that I'm a part of, and I'm part of my Democratic group, and we're also part of a Facebook group called Faith Shift Ministry. That was the first Facebook group we've discovered before we found you guys.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's another group that is former ministry and missionary workers. So that's been a really nice group to be a part of as well. So I feel like we're doing okay, I mean, so we're thankful for that.
So I have a few questions. One, I understand that you're now a part of a Unitarian church. I'd like to hear about. I'd like to hear about that, and then I've got some more questions as well.
Yeah, I was on because I became politically sort of involved. I went to some of these marches, and one of them was March for Our Lives after one of the many gun shootings, mass massacres. We had a march that we went to against gun violence and so on. And I was on a shuttle bus from a church to the march. And I met this couple, and here he had been a pastor. And so we, struck up a conversation, and he said, "Oh, we're part of the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg. You should try us, So that sort of introduced me to the Unitarian Church of Harrisburg, and we're very happy there. It's very inclusive, and it's very justice oriented, and that makes us really excited. And we don't have to go every Sunday. It's not
yeah. Yeah, you're not going to hell if you miss a Sunday.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
So there's freedom in that, and it seems to fit us right now. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I definitely think the UU Church is an option for people along the road, right? Yeah, I think that's
I
great.
would recommend it. Yeah.
And then you specifically talked about how hard it was to tell your mom and some friends. I'm curious, how about with your children? Like, obviously, your children are adults, and they would have their own sense of faith. So I'm curious what that is like these days.
Well, they were very they were very angry when Paul got fired.
Okay.
they you know, came alongside of us and really expressed their displeasure with that. They are none of them actually go to church.
Okay.
They're all sort of different from each other. I think we must have done something right to like give them freedom to have these. I mean, our oldest son has some really strange ideas about stuff, about life and death I mean, so they're very creative in their way of looking at life and death and religion and stuff.
Yeah.
Our youngest son is actually the most Christian oriented one. He feeds the homeless in New York City. He's the head of a group called City Relief, and homelessness is his passion to work in that, be active in that issue. But his group is Christian based, and they use a lot of volunteers from churches come help them.
Okay.
So he sort of has to walk, has to be, walk sort of a line of in between.
Understood. Yeah. But hey, I'll say more Christians out feeding the homeless. That's fine with me.
Yeah, exactly.
I often talk about many of the debates between Christians and, in my case, secular humanists, is that, well, you can't justify why you ought to be good or kind to people. And I think, I don't care. If you want to go be kind and good to people and I want to go be kind and good to people, let's just go do that together and stop arguing with each other.
Right. So, yeah, we can have that common ground, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm glad to hear what your son is doing. That's great work.
Yeah, no, I'm thankful that we do feel good with our kids, and they're very respectful and appreciate, and I think they're more surprised, or whatever the word is, than they let on.
Okay.
Of our change.
Okay.
That's what I think.
Okay, got it. So last question, what we often ask, you've mentioned a handful of books. Mm-hmm. Anything, that helped you through the current version of deconstruction for you? Books, podcasts, YouTube, that kind of thing.
Well, I do listen to a lot of podcasts, and I highly recommend yours as well. That's really been encouragement to me. And the Faith Shift Ministry group.
Okay.
And as I said, I think I still really highly recommend John Philip Newell and the Celtic, his Celtic theology books. They're really interesting. I'm also into, instead of praying, I listen to Tara Brach, who is she's a Buddhist person who leads meditations and stuff. I really like, that's a go-to for me for, calming my anxiety or whatever. I really appreciate Tara Brach. Yeah, I have a lot of resources that I go to. I can't think of any other ones at the moment, but I kind of go where the universe leads, sort of.
Yes.
I want to be a lifelong learner. I'm 71, and I just want to learn. I want to be teachable, and curious, and that's really my desire for the last years of my life.
That is incredible. I can't recommend that enough, to be curious, to search after truth wherever you find it. So, yeah. Deb, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Really appreciate telling your story.
Oh, thank you, David. I appreciate doing that.
Final thoughts on the episode. Deb's is an incredible story, an entire lifetime of faithful service and dedication and being all in, even to the point of moving to foreign countries when that clearly wasn't something she wanted to do. Continuing to serve when they returned back to the United States, leading various ministries, and generally just caring for people. to then have the slap in the face of Paul's ordination being rejected and further insult to injury with Paul being let go, it's just devastating. In other words, if a couple who has dedicated their lives to missionary work for decades and pastoral work for a number of years, if they cannot be ordained, who can be? I really appreciate Deb's voracious curiosity that she has been reading book after book after book. She has expanded her understanding of what faith means to her, and she has a desire to be a lifelong learner. I think this is the exciting part about deconstruction. I know there can be downsides. I know there are costs. It must have been incredibly difficult to lose friends, to have difficult conversations with family. But the opportunity to explore one's curiosity, to find out the truth as you see it, without bounds, without restrictions, without someone telling you this is how far you can go and you can go no further. Deb really captured the feeling of being out of the church context. So the first time that she was no longer going to church and the freedom that she experienced. She said, after 60 years of feeling like I have to go to church every time the doors are open, it was just amazing, the release. As I've said a few times now, I think when people are outside the reinforcement of the bubble and they begin to just reevaluate what they think and what they believe without restraints, without pressure, often a person can change their mind. And Deb is that example. I want to thank Deb for being on the podcast, for telling her story with such honesty and passion. I love your curiosity, Deb. Thank you for being on the podcast. The Secular Grace Thought of the Week is about the Dunns. Again, people like Deb who lived literally decades, in her case, 6 decades of faithful service in one capacity or another, and in Deb's case, for 50 of those years in a professional capacity as a minister or pastoral. And then to reevaluate, then to have a change of heart is so profound a story. And it is one that I think the evangelical church is ignoring or minimizing or pretending doesn't exist. We have highlighted a number of people who are in that category, and we're going to have Paul on next week as well to tell his story. And I just think these are really significant and important stories to tell for 2 reasons. One, as I said in Ruby's episode the previous week, that Christianity cannot satisfy the faithful, and it's the most faithful who are the least satisfied. And then 2, it also gives us hope that people can change their minds. You can change your mind. I can change my mind, even after decades of life. We can all learn. We can all grow. We can all discover something new about the world. And that is a really hopeful message. And I thank Deb for giving us that hope today. Next week, it is Deb's husband, Paul, and he will share his side of the story and how he experienced it. And it is interesting to hear the different perspectives on the same life story. There's a small chance that won't be next week, but 2 weeks from now, I'm going to try everything I can to get that out next week. But regardless, please tune in for Paul's story. And the episode after that will be about the Blue Water Atheists, Humanists, and Agnostics Conference that's happening in Ontario, Canada in August of this year. And we have Bob Barnes on to tell us about that. And he is quite a character, so you're not going to want to miss that either. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.